Welcome back to Unknown Suspect. Tonight, we return to a world where order is prized, appearances deceive, and truth hides in the smallest details. Join the brilliant Belgian detective Hercule Poirot as he steps into a house governed by routine, precision, and time itself. What begins as a polite invitation soon becomes a dangerous puzzle of misdirection and silence. Listen closely. Every word matters. Every moment counts. Because in this mystery, time does not simply pass. It reveals. Chapter 1. An unsettling invitation. Hercule Poirot disliked arriving anywhere in a hurry. Disorder, he believed, invited mistakes, and mistakes offended the little grey cells. Thus, when the motorcar finally turned through the wrought-iron gates of Ashcroft Hall, he experienced a quiet satisfaction. Everything had occurred precisely as planned. Ashcroft Hall rose from the landscape with restrained dignity. It was not grand in the theatrical sense, but solid, symmetrical, and deliberate. Brickwork balanced, windows evenly spaced, and ivy trimmed with almost military discipline. Poirot approved. A house, like a mind, revealed much by its sense of order. The gravel drive crunched beneath the tires as the car came to a halt. Poirot descended carefully, smoothing his coat and adjusting his tie before surveying the scene. The air held the mild chill of early autumn, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Somewhere within the house, a clock chimed the hour. Clear, precise, and oddly insistent. Almost at once, Poirot noticed something peculiar. Another chime followed a moment later from a different direction. The two sounds did not quite agree. Poirot's eyebrows rose imperceptibly. A tall man in a dark jacket approached. "Monsieur Poirot? I am Parker, the butler. Sir Lionel Ashcroft is expecting you." "Merci," said Poirot. "I am always pleased when expectation and reality meet in harmony." Parker blinked, uncertain how to reply, and led the way inside. The interior of Ashcroft Hall was cool and restrained. Polished wood, pale rugs, carefully chosen paintings, nothing extravagant, nothing careless. Yet Poirot sensed a tension beneath the calm surface, as though the house were holding its breath. They passed through the entrance hall, where a large grandfather clock stood against the wall. Its pendulum swung steadily, but Poirot noted that its ticking seemed slightly out of step with the chime he had heard outside. Interesting. In the drawing room, Sir Lionel Ashcroft rose to greet him. He was a tall, thin man with neatly combed grey hair and sharp, restless eyes. Though he smiled, the gesture did not quite reach them. "Monsieur Poirot," he said warmly, "thank you for coming on such short notice." "For a friend," said Poirot, clasping the offered hand, "I always make the time." Sir Lionel's smile tightened. "Yes, time." He hesitated, then gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit. There is much I wish to discuss." Poirot sat, taking in the room. A mantel clock stood above the fireplace. A smaller carriage clock rested on a side table. Both showed different times. Sir Lionel followed his gaze and gave a short, humourless laugh. "You see them, of course." "I see everything," Poirot replied gently. "I cannot bear inconsistency," Sir Lionel said. "Yet in this house, it surrounds me." Before Poirot could respond, the door opened and Lady Ashcroft entered. She was elegant, cool, and impeccably dressed, her movements controlled and precise. A faint scent of lavender followed her. "Monsieur Poirot," she said politely, "you are very welcome." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, the pleasure is mine." She studied him for a moment, then turned to her husband. "Tea will be served shortly." "Thank you, my dear." As she left, Sir Lionel leaned forward. "You see, everything is orderly, and yet—" He broke off, shaking his head. Poirot waited. Silence, he knew, often encouraged truth. At last, Sir Lionel spoke again. "I fear I am being deceived, not robbed, not threatened, but misled. Time, Monsieur Poirot, time itself seems unreliable." Poirot folded his hands. "Tell me what troubles you." But before Sir Lionel could answer, voices sounded in the corridor. The door opened, admitting 3 more people. First came Gerald Ashcroft, Sir Lionel's nephew, a young man with sharp features and an impatient air. He nodded briefly to Poirot, already distracted by the room. Behind him was Miss Eleanor Finch, Sir Lionel's secretary. She carried a notebook clutched tightly to her chest and looked faintly nervous, though her expression was polite. Last was Mr. Bernard Hale, broad-shouldered and confident, with the assured manner of a man accustomed to negotiation. His smile was friendly, but calculated. Introductions were made. Poirot observed each person closely. Gerald's restless movements, Miss Finch's quick glances toward Sir Lionel, Mr. Hale's calm appraisal of everyone present. Tea was served. As cups were passed around, Poirot noticed something else. Each person reached for their cup at slightly different moments, as though responding to an invisible signal only they could hear. "Tell me," Poirot said lightly, "you are all punctual people?" Sir Lionel laughed shortly. "Once, yes. Now, I am no longer certain what punctual even means." Gerald snorted. "Uncle exaggerates. He's become obsessed with his clocks." "Obsessed?" Sir Lionel snapped. "Because I notice when things are wrong?" Mr. Hale raised a placating hand. "Let us not quarrel. Stress does strange things." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Stress, yes, but also fear. As the conversation drifted, Poirot continued to observe. Miss Finch checked her wristwatch twice in 5 minutes. Lady Ashcroft glanced toward the mantel clock whenever someone spoke too long. Gerald tapped his fingers, counting silently. And every so often, from different corners of the house, a clock would chime, never together, never quite agreeing. As evening approached, Sir Lionel seemed increasingly agitated. Finally, he rose. "I am tired," he said abruptly. "Tomorrow, Monsieur Poirot, I will explain everything. Tonight, I must rest." Lady Ashcroft stood at once. "I'll bring you your cocoa." Sir Lionel nodded absently and turned to Poirot. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "Everything will make sense then." Poirot inclined his head. "I shall look forward to it." Sir Lionel left the room, followed by his wife. One by one, the others excused themselves. Soon, Poirot was alone. The silence felt heavy. Somewhere above, a door closed. A clock chimed, then another, a minute later. Poirot rose and approached the mantel clock, examining it closely. Its face was immaculate, its hands precise. Yet it was wrong. He was certain of it. He took out his own watch, synchronized meticulously that morning. "Ah," he murmured softly, "so that is how it begins." Outside, the sky darkened, and Ashcroft Hall settled into the uneasy stillness of night. By morning, everything would change. Chapter 2. Death at Dawn. Hercule Poirot awoke precisely at 6 o'clock, as was his habit, refreshed and orderly, in both body and mind. For a few moments he lay still, listening. Ashcroft Hall was quiet, too quiet perhaps. Even the clocks seemed subdued, their ticking muffled by distance and thick walls. Then came the sound that altered everything. A sharp knock at the door, hurried and uneven. Poirot rose at once, slipped into his dressing gown, and opened the door. Parker, the butler, stood there, his usually composed face drained of colour. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice carefully controlled but strained, "I am very sorry to disturb you. There has been an incident." Poirot studied him for a brief second. "Sir Lionel?" Parker swallowed. "Yes, sir." Poirot nodded. "Take me to him." They moved swiftly through the corridors. As they passed the grandfather clock in the hall, Poirot noticed it chiming the half-hour. Almost immediately, a smaller clock in a side room chimed the hour. Poirot frowned but said nothing. Sir Lionel's study was at the rear of the house, overlooking the gardens. The door stood open. Inside, Lady Ashcroft sat stiffly in a chair near the wall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Gerald Ashcroft stood by the fireplace, pale and furious. Miss Finch hovered near the desk, her face white with shock. Mr. Hale leaned against the bookcase, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. And at the desk sat Sir Lionel Ashcroft. He was upright in his chair, his head slightly tilted, his eyes closed as though in thought. One hand rested neatly beside a stack of papers, the other lay on the armrest. At first glance it appeared he might simply be asleep. Poirot knew better. He approached slowly, observing every detail. There was no sign of violence, no overturned furniture, no spilt drink. Everything was orderly, painfully so. Poirot placed 2 fingers gently against Sir Lionel's wrist. Cold. "He's been dead some hours," Poirot said quietly. Lady Ashcroft gave a low, controlled sound, not quite a sob. Miss Finch covered her mouth with her hand. Gerald turned sharply. "Dead?" he repeated. "How? He was fine last night." Poirot straightened. "Madame, may I ask, did Sir Lionel drink his cocoa?" Lady Ashcroft nodded automatically. "Yes, as always. I brought it to him around 10. At what time did you leave him?" 10:15. He was reading?" Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you." He turned to Miss Finch. "Mademoiselle, did you see Sir Lionel later?" She hesitated. "Yes, around 10:30. He asked me to bring some documents." "And he was well?" "He seemed tired, but not ill." Poirot looked to Gerald. "And you, monsieur?" Gerald's jaw tightened. "I spoke to him earlier. We argued, but I didn't see him again." Mr. Hale spoke smoothly. "I retired early. I was writing letters in my room." Poirot nodded, filing each statement carefully away. At that moment, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Inspector Webb entered, accompanied by a local constable. He was a solid man with a practical manner and a face that suggested little patience for unnecessary complications. "Well," he said, glancing around, "this is unfortunate." Poirot greeted him politely. "Inspector." Webb nodded. "Doctor's on his way, but I can tell you already. No wounds, no signs of struggle. That usually points one way." "Poison," said Poirot calmly. Webb raised an eyebrow. "You work fast." "Experience, mon ami." The doctor arrived shortly after and confirmed Poirot's conclusion. The poison was tasteless, odorless, and slow-acting, administered several hours before death. "So," Inspector Webb said, rubbing his chin, "someone poisoned his drink." "Or his food," Poirot corrected gently. "But the cocoa fits," Webb continued, "prepared by Lady Ashcroft, served alone, open and shut." Lady Ashcroft stiffened. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm stating facts," said Webb. "Motive comes later." Poirot stepped forward smoothly. "Inspector, if you please, may we not hurry? The truth, like good cuisine, requires patience." Webb sighed. "All right, ask your questions." Poirot moved about the room, examining the desk. Papers were neatly stacked. A pen lay aligned with mathematical precision. On one corner sat a small brass travelling clock. Poirot touched it lightly. It was warm. Interesting. He took out his own watch again. The time did not match any of the clocks in the room. Poirot turned to Inspector Webb. "At what time was the body discovered?" 6:15, said Webb. "And who discovered it?" "Lady Ashcroft. She came to wake him." Poirot nodded. "And you are all certain of your times last night?" There was a brief silence. "Yes." Gerald said sharply. Why wouldn't we be? Poirot smiled faintly. Because, monsieur, each of you has given me a different hour. Miss Finch looked startled. But I checked my watch. Mr. Hale shrugged. Clocks can be wrong. Indeed, Poirot said softly. But memories, they are even more delicate. Inspector Webb frowned. Are you saying their statements don't line up? Precisely. He gestured toward the clocks around the room. Observe, none agree, and yet each of you relied upon one. Lady Ashcroft looked uneasy. Sir Lionel was always adjusting them. Ah, said Poirot, always? Miss Finch nodded. He disliked disorder. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And yet he allowed this? Webb folded his arms. What are you suggesting? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to the body, noting the calm expression on Sir Lionel's face. There was no panic, he said quietly. No pain, at least not sudden. He trusted the hand that served him. Lady Ashcroft looked away. Gerald clenched his fists. This is ridiculous. Someone killed him, and you're talking about clocks. Poirot turned to him. Monsieur, when time itself is confused, one must ask who benefits. Silence fell again. Inspector Webb cleared his throat. We'll question everyone properly. Until then, no one leaves. Poirot inclined his head. Naturally. As the others filed out, Poirot lingered. He adjusted the small travelling clock on the desk, ever so slightly. Sleep well, Sir Lionel, he murmured. You have already given me the first clue. Outside the window, dawn light spread across the gardens, pale and cold. The day had begun, but for one man, time had already run out. Chapter 3. Small details, large. Meaning, the morning advanced with deceptive calm. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Ashcroft Hall, softening the severity of the previous night's events. Yet for Hercule Poirot, the house no longer felt merely uncomfortable, it felt expressive, as though every object wished to speak. After breakfast, Inspector Webb allowed Poirot a period of quiet examination. The body had been removed, and Sir Lionel's study stood undisturbed, sealed off except for their presence. Poirot entered slowly, closing the door behind him. He stood still for a full minute, absorbing the room as a whole. Disorder announced itself loudly, but order, when false, whispered. He began with the desk. Sir Lionel's papers were arranged with care, financial documents, personal correspondence, and a neatly folded letter addressed to Miss Finch, unopened. Poirot did not read it. Instead, he noted its position. It lay atop the others, placed deliberately. He intended it to be found, Poirot murmured. The cocoa cup had been removed, but a faint ring marked where it had rested. Poirot bent closer. There was no visible residue, no spillage. Sir Lionel had drunk it calmly, without suspicion. Poirot straightened and inhaled slowly. Lavender. It was faint now, but unmistakable. Poirot knew the scent well. Lady Ashcroft wore it carefully, sparingly, as a woman who valued control. But Poirot did not leap to conclusions. Scents, like words, could be transferred. He turned his attention to the clocks. The mantel clock above the fireplace ticked steadily. The carriage clock on the side table showed a different time. The small travelling clock on the desk, Sir Lionel's desk, displayed yet another. Poirot took out his watch once more. 3 lies, he said softly, and 1 truth. He examined the travelling clock closely. It was finely made, expensive, and recently polished. Yet something was odd. A tiny smear on the brass casing, almost invisible unless one looked carefully. Poirot dabbed it with his handkerchief. Ink. Not Sir Lionel's, Poirot concluded. His hands were always clean. He replaced the clock exactly as it had been. A knock sounded at the door. Inspector Webb entered, notebook in hand. "Found anything useful?" Poirot smiled mildly. "I have found that nothing here is useless," Webb sighed. "We've started interviews. They all say the same things again. Lady Ashcroft insists she left him alive. Miss Finch swears he was fine at 10:30. Hale says he was alone. The nephew admits the argument but denies everything else." "And the times?" Poirot asked. Webb grimaced. "Still don't match." Poirot nodded. "Of course." He moved toward the window, gazing out at the garden. "Inspector, tell me, have you ever noticed how people trust clocks more than themselves?" Webb shrugged. "I suppose." "They surrender judgment to them," Poirot continued. "If the clock says 10, it must be 10, even if the sun disagrees, even if the body does." Webb frowned. "You think the time of death is wrong?" "I think," Poirot replied carefully, "that it has been persuaded to appear so." They left the study and moved into the corridor. Poirot paused by the grandfather clock and listened. Its ticking was steady but faintly irregular. "Who winds the clocks?" Poirot asked. "Sir Lionel used to," Webb said, "but lately Miss Finch helped, sometimes the butler." Poirot nodded. "And who last adjusted them?" Webb hesitated. "That I don't know." Poirot smiled. "Then we shall find out." They proceeded to the drawing room, where Miss Finch sat alone, her notebook resting unused on her lap. She rose at once when Poirot entered. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly, "may I trouble you with a few questions?" "Of course," she said quickly. Too quickly. Poirot gestured for her to sit. "You were devoted to Sir Lionel." She nodded, her eyes lowering. "He was, demanding, but fair." "You noticed changes recently?" "Yes," she admitted. "He was anxious, distracted." "About what?" She hesitated. "About time." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Explain." "He believed something was wrong," she said. "That events did not align, that someone was interfering." "With the clocks?" "With more than that," she said softly. Poirot watched her closely. "Did he confide in you?" "Yes." "He asked me to prepare documents? Changes to his affairs?" Webb looked up sharply. "What changes?" Miss Finch glanced at Poirot, uncertain. Poirot nodded encouragingly. "You may tell the inspector." "He altered his will," she said, "reduced Gerald's inheritance, created a charitable trust." Webb scribbled rapidly. "Who managed the trust?" Miss Finch swallowed. "Mr. Hale." Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "Did Sir Lionel intend to tell him?" Poirot asked. "Yes, today," she said. "He wanted everything finalized." Poirot rose. "Thank you, mademoiselle." As they left, Webb muttered, "It gives us motive. It gives us a direction," Poirot corrected. They found Gerald Ashcroft pacing in the library. He looked up sharply. "You've been whispering," he said. "I don't like it." Poirot regarded him calmly. "Monsieur, impatience is understandable, but not helpful." Gerald scoffed. "My uncle was obsessed. Clock schedules, routines, anyone could have tampered with them." "Ah," said Poirot. "Anyone, but did they?" Gerald frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Nothing yet." Later, Poirot encountered Mr. Hale in the corridor. Hale's manner was relaxed, his voice smooth. "Terrible business," Hale said. "Sir Lionel was a difficult man, but brilliant." "Difficult men," Poirot replied, "often uncover inconvenient truths." Hale's smile faltered, just for a moment. Poirot inclined his head and continued on. That afternoon, Poirot did something curious. In full view of the staff, he adjusted the mantel clock in the drawing room, only by 5 minutes. No one commented. An hour later, Poirot returned. One person stood staring at the clock, frowning deeply, Mr. Bernard Hale. Poirot watched from the doorway. "Ah," he murmured, "so you notice." The little grey cells stirred. The house was beginning to speak clearly now, and Poirot was listening. Chapter 4. The Psychology of Guilt. If the previous day had belonged to facts, the next belonged to feelings. Hercule Poirot believed firmly that guilt announced itself not only through action, but through temperament. A man might control his words, even his gestures, but his inner unease revealed itself in subtler ways, in irritation, in false calm, in the need to explain too much. Ashcroft Hall, as the afternoon wore on, became a study in restrained discomfort. Poirot chose not to question anyone directly for several hours. Instead, he placed himself where he could observe. He sat in the drawing room with a small notebook, apparently absorbed in writing, while the household went about its constrained routines. Lady Ashcroft entered first. She moved with her usual elegance, poured herself tea, and sat by the window. Her posture was perfect, her hands steady. Yet Poirot noticed that she did not drink. The cup cooled untouched. Grief, Poirot knew, expressed itself differently in each soul. Lady Ashcroft's sorrow was rigid, controlled, perhaps too controlled, but control alone was not guilt. It was simply habit. Gerald Ashcroft appeared next, restless as ever. He crossed the room repeatedly, stopping to stare out of the windows, then resuming his pacing. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried sharp edges. "They're treating me like a criminal," he muttered at one point, glancing toward Poirot. Poirot looked up mildly. "Monsieur, when one is innocent, time is one's ally." Gerald snorted. "Time again! Everyone keeps talking about time." Poirot smiled faintly and returned to his notebook. Miss Finch arrived quietly, carrying papers she no longer needed. She sorted them, rearranged them, then rearranged them again. Her movements were quick, efficient, but her eyes betrayed anxiety, not fear of arrest, Poirot observed, but fear of being misunderstood, of failing in some duty she still believed herself bound to fulfill. Poirot made a mental note. Mr. Bernard Hale entered last. He greeted everyone with an easy nod, took a seat, and began reading a newspaper. His manner was relaxed, almost too relaxed, given the circumstances. Poirot watched him carefully. At precisely 3 o'clock, the mantel clock chimed. A moment later, a clock in the hallway answered. Hale looked up sharply. Poirot saw it. The reaction was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tightening of the jaw, a flicker of irritation. Poirot closed his notebook. Later, he approached Miss Finch in the library, where she stood alone, gazing at the shelves as though seeking guidance from the books themselves. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "may I walk with you?" She nodded, relieved to be addressed kindly. They moved slowly along the shelves. "You are troubled," Poirot said. She hesitated, then sighed. "Sir Lionel trusted me, and now he is gone, and everything feels unfinished." "Unfinished how?" "He was about to confront someone," she said quietly. "I know that." Poirot stopped. "Did he tell you whom?" "No, but he was determined. He said order must be restored." Poirot smiled slightly. "He was a man after my own heart." Miss Finch looked at him sharply. "Do you really believe order will return?" "It always does," Poirot replied. "But first, confusion must exhaust itself." They returned to the drawing room. Poirot noticed Lady Ashcroft watching Miss Finch with an unreadable expression. That evening, Inspector Webb grew impatient. "We've got motive for the nephew," he said bluntly. "He stood to lose money. We've got opportunity for the wife. She served the drink. What are we waiting for?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "Inspector, tell me, if Lady Ashcroft were guilty, would she leave the house so orderly? Would she invite a detective known for patience? Webb hesitated. Some criminals are arrogant. True, Poirot agreed. But arrogance makes noise. This crime whispers. He rose. May I try a small experiment? Webb sighed. At this point, why not? Poirot went to the hallway and adjusted the grandfather clock, again by 5 minutes. He did so openly, without explanation, then returned to his seat. They waited. Minutes passed. Lady Ashcroft did not react. Gerald did not notice. Miss Finch glanced once, then looked away. Mr. Hale stood abruptly. That clock is wrong, he said sharply. Poirot looked up. Is it? Yes, Hale replied, forcing a smile. It was correct before. Poirot tilted his head. How do you know? Hale paused. Because I checked it earlier. When? Poirot asked. Just now. Earlier, Hale said, growing irritated. Why does this matter? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Because, monsieur, you notice changes you claim not to care about. The room fell silent. Hale laughed shortly. Are you suggesting I killed a man because I watched the time? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Inspector Webb. Inspector, would you be so kind as to confirm something for me? Webb frowned. What? The poison, Poirot said. It required precise timing, yes? Yes. Administered hours before death. Not impulsive, Poirot said. Not emotional. He turned back to Hale. A crime of calculation. Hale's smile thinned. You're fond of theories. Poirot inclined his head. I am fond of patterns. That night, Poirot stood alone in Sir Lionel's study once more. He examined the travelling clock on the desk. He turned it over carefully. Inside, the mechanism was pristine, but something small was missing. A pin. Poirot straightened slowly. Ah, he murmured, so that is how you persuaded time itself. Outside, Ashcroft Hall slept uneasily, but Poirot's little grey cells were very much awake. The psychology of guilt had revealed its first clear shape. Chapter 5. Red Herring. The dining room of Ashcroft Hall had the uncomfortable grandeur of a place designed for certainty rather than doubt. Morning light filtered through tall windows, catching on silverware and polished wood, turning every reflection sharp and watchful. Hercule Poirot sat at one end of the long table, hands folded, eyes attentive. Inspector Webb stood opposite him, impatient energy radiating from his stiff posture. The suspects took their seats with varying degrees of reluctance. Lady Ashcroft sat upright, composed, her face pale but controlled. Gerald Ashcroft slouched slightly, resentment visible in every movement. Miss Finch settled nervously, straightening papers that required no arrangement. Mr. Bernard Hale leaned back with apparent ease, though his eyes missed nothing. Inspector Webb cleared his throat. We're going to address a few matters plainly, he said. No riddles, no philosophy, facts. Poirot smiled faintly but said nothing. Webb turned first to Gerald. You argued with your uncle the night he died. Gerald lifted his chin. Yes, about money, about my future. And you stood to lose a great deal if his new will stood, Webb pressed. I stood to lose respect, Gerald snapped. Sir Lionel enjoyed control. This was just another way of exerting it. You were angry. I was honest, Gerald replied sharply. That doesn't make me a murderer. Poirot watched Gerald closely. Anger, he knew, was often mistaken for guilt because it was visible, but visibility was not proof. Webb shifted his attention. Lady Ashcroft, you prepared the cocoa. Yes, she said calmly. As I did every night. You were alone with him? For 15 minutes. We spoke of trivial matters. He showed no distress. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Madame, did your husband trust you? Completely, she replied without hesitation. Poirot nodded. Trust, too, could mislead. Webb turned next to Miss Finch. "You visited him late. Why?" "He requested documents," she said quietly. "Changes he wished to finalize." "Which involved reducing Gerald's inheritance," Webb said. "Yes." "And placing funds into a trust managed by Mr. Hale?" Miss Finch hesitated, then nodded. All eyes shifted briefly to Hale. Webb tapped his pen against his notebook. "Mr. Hale, you benefited from these changes." Hale smiled thinly. "Only professionally. Sir Lionel trusted my experience." Poirot interjected gently. "Trust, monsieur, is a delicate instrument. It must be tuned carefully." Hale's smile did not reach his eyes. "Are you suggesting otherwise?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied. "I observe." Inspector Webb dismissed them with a sharp gesture. "That's all for now." As they rose, tension lingered in the air like static. Each person left with their own version of relief or frustration. Poirot remained seated. Webb exhaled loudly. "Every one of them could have done it?" "Indeed," Poirot agreed, "which is precisely why none of them appear convincing." Webb frowned. "You're saying all this evidence means nothing?" "Not nothing," Poirot said softly, "but distraction." They moved into the adjoining corridor, where the sound of ticking followed them like a quiet echo. "The nephew is angry," Poirot continued, "but anger seeks expression. This crime is restrained." "The wife had opportunity," Webb argued. "And affection," Poirot replied. "She gains nothing but solitude." Webb scowled. "You dismiss everything." "No," Poirot said. "I arrange it." That afternoon, Poirot wandered through the house alone, apparently without purpose. In truth, every step was measured. He examined the library shelves, noting which books were disturbed. He passed through the kitchen, observing the neat rows of ingredients, the absence of chaos. He stopped briefly at the servants' corridor, listening to murmured conversations fade at his approach. Then he returned to the drawing room. The clocks greeted him at once. Each marked a different moment. Each insisted upon its own authority. Poirot sat and waited. Lady Ashcroft entered first. She paused when she saw him, then continued calmly to the window seat. "You are very quiet today, Monsieur Poirot?" she said. "I am listening," he replied. She regarded him steadily. "Do you believe my husband was killed by someone close to him?" Poirot folded his hands. "Madame, closeness is not measured by affection alone." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed a private thought. Gerald entered next, carrying a book he did not open. He glanced at Poirot with barely concealed hostility. "You enjoy watching us squirm," he said. Poirot smiled gently. "I enjoy understanding." Miss Finch followed, stopping short when she noticed the others. She lingered near the door, uncertain. Mr. Hale arrived last. As he crossed the room, the mantel clock chimed. Hale's gaze snapped upward instantly. Poirot noted it. "Annoying things," Hale muttered. "These clocks." Poirot tilted his head. "Are they?" "They're wrong," Hale said sharply. "They've been wrong for days." "And yet," Poirot said mildly, "you notice precisely when they change." Hale stiffened. "Anyone would." "Not anyone," Poirot replied. The tension thickened. Lady Ashcroft stood. "This is intolerable. Accusations disguised as conversation." Poirot rose at once. "Madame, forgive me. I accuse no one, yet." Inspector Webb entered at that moment, relief flickering briefly across his face. "We've received confirmation on the poison," he announced. "Rare compound, expensive, requires precise handling." "Not something kept casually," Poirot said. "Exactly," Webb replied. "Which narrows the field." Poirot nodded. "It narrows, but it also misleads." Webb frowned. "How so?" "Because Poirot said. "The obvious trail is designed to be followed." He turned to the group. "Sir Lionel Ashcroft was a man who valued control. His death reflects that value. There was no haste, no chaos, only planning." Gerald laughed bitterly. "So we're all chess pieces now?" "In a sense," Poirot replied calmly. "Yes." That evening, Poirot dined alone. He replayed the day's interactions carefully, discarding false signals. Anger without strategy, grief without gain, fear without motive. Red herrings, he knew, were not accidents. They were placed deliberately, like signposts pointing away from the truth. Later, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Poirot returned to Sir Lionel's study once more. He examined the desk, the papers, the clock. Everything pointed everywhere. Except one thing. The crime required patience, knowledge, and an intimate understanding of order. Someone who valued precision. Someone who noticed when it was disturbed. Poirot straightened his tie. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "the distractions will fall away." And somewhere within Ashcroft Hall, the truth waited quietly, perfectly timed. Chapter 6. Time reveals. Its secret. Ashcroft Hall entered its third day of mourning with a sense of tightening pressure, as though the walls themselves were drawing inward. The clocks continued their quiet rebellion, each asserting a different version of reality, each insisting upon its own authority. To Inspector Webb, they were an irritation. To Hercule Poirot, they were beginning to speak plainly. The morning began with a discovery. Poirot was alone in the study, standing at Sir Lionel's desk, the small travelling clock resting in his gloved hands. He had examined it many times already, but repetition, he believed, was not redundancy. Truth revealed itself only to those patient enough to invite it again. He opened the back of the clock carefully. The mechanism inside was pristine, well-maintained, and deliberately interfered with. A thin metal pin, normally used to regulate the movement, was missing. In its place were faint scratch marks, barely visible, where the pin had been removed and replaced more than once. Poirot closed the clock gently. "So," he murmured, "you were not broken, you were persuaded." A knock came at the door. Inspector Webb entered, looking tired and irritable. "We've checked the chemists in the area. The poison could only have been obtained by someone with money and connections." Poirot nodded. "And discretion." Webb folded his arms. "You're thinking of Hale again." "I am thinking," Poirot corrected, "of timing." Webb frowned. "We already know the poison was slow-acting." "Yes," Poirot said, "but not slow enough to explain the confusion." He gestured toward the clocks. "Inspector, what time do you believe Sir Lionel died?" Webb consulted his notes. "Sometime between midnight and 2. Poirot shook his head gently. "No?" Webb stiffened. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean," Poirot replied calmly, "that Sir Lionel Ashcroft was already dying while his household believed him to be merely tired." Webb stared. "That's a bold claim." Poirot smiled. "Then let us be bold together." They summoned the household to the drawing room. The atmosphere was strained, voices subdued, movements cautious. Poirot stood near the mantel clock, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "you have all been confused by time. You have relied upon clocks which did not agree and memories which trusted those clocks." Gerald crossed his arms. "Get to the point." Poirot inclined his head. "Very well. Sir Lionel Ashcroft was poisoned earlier than any of you believe." Miss Finch gasped softly. Lady Ashcroft looked up sharply. "How much earlier?" Inspector Webb demanded. "Before 10 o'clock, Poirot replied. "Possibly before 9. "That's impossible," Lady Ashcroft said. "He was well at 10. "Was he?" Poirot asked gently. She hesitated. He was calm. Calm, Poirot repeated. Yes, the poison induced drowsiness before pain. He trusted the drink he consumed. Webb rubbed his chin. And then why all the confusion with the times? Poirot gestured toward the clocks. Because the murderer needed you to argue about when, so you would not ask who. Gerald laughed sharply. You're saying someone changed the clocks to confuse us? Yes, Poirot replied simply. Miss Finch spoke hesitantly. Sir Lionel adjusted them often. True, Poirot said, but recently he was ill at ease. He noticed discrepancies he had not created. Mr. Hale shifted slightly in his chair. Poirot continued, his voice steady. The travelling clock on the desk was not Sir Lionel's. It was placed there after his death. That's absurd, Hale said smoothly. Why would anyone do that? To anchor the lie, Poirot replied. To give the room a false certainty. Webb leaned forward. You have proof. Poirot smiled faintly. I have behaviour. He turned to the group. Yesterday I altered the clocks deliberately. Only one of you noticed consistently. Only one of you reacted with irritation rather than confusion. Hale laughed. This is ridiculous. I'm a businessman, not a clockmaker. No, Poirot agreed. But you are a man who values precision. Hale's smile tightened. Poirot turned away, refusing to press the moment. Inspector, may I ask, have you confirmed when Sir Lionel last ate? Webb nodded. Early dinner, no unusual food. Then the poison was in the cocoa, Poirot said. But not the cocoa Lady Ashcroft served. Lady Ashcroft stiffened. What do you mean? I mean, Poirot said gently, that Sir Lionel drank cocoa twice that evening. A murmur rippled through the room. Impossible, Gerald said. Why would he? Poirot looked at Miss Finch. Did Sir Lionel often take refreshments while working? Yes, she said, if someone brought them. Poirot turned slowly. Someone like a guest. Silence fell. Inspector Webb's eyes narrowed. Mr. Hale? Hale raised his eyebrows. You're suggesting I brought him cocoa earlier? I am suggesting, Poirot replied carefully, that you visited Sir Lionel privately under the pretence of business. That's speculation. Is it? Poirot asked. You had reason to ensure Sir Lionel would not speak the following day. Miss Finch's face drained of colour. The trust, she whispered. Poirot nodded. Sir Lionel intended to confront irregularities. Hale rose abruptly. This is outrageous. Where is your evidence? Poirot met his gaze calmly. Not yet complete. Webb stood. Mr. Hale, you'll remain here. Hale sat back down, jaw clenched. That afternoon, Poirot walked alone through the gardens, replaying the sequence carefully. The murderer had acted early, adjusted time, and trusted that human reliance on clocks would do the rest. But something still troubled Poirot, not how Sir Lionel died, but how the murderer ensured silence. That evening, Poirot returned to the study and examined the letter addressed to Miss Finch. This time he read it. It was brief. Eleanor, tomorrow I must speak plainly. There are matters of trust which can no longer wait. Poirot folded the letter carefully. So, he murmured, you knew. As night fell, Ashcroft Hall seemed to pause, suspended between accusation and certainty. The clocks ticked on, stubborn and uneven. Poirot adjusted none of them. Tomorrow, he knew, would not be about time. It would be about truth. Chapter 7. The Final Thread. That night, Ashcroft Hall slept poorly. Doors creaked, footsteps echoed where none should have been, and the clocks, still stubbornly out of harmony, measured the hours with quiet insistence. For most of the household, sleep came only in fragments. For Hercule Poirot, it did not come at all. He sat in the small armchair beside the window of his guest room, his posture relaxed, his mind sharply focused. The events of the past days arrange themselves neatly now, no longer a scattering of impressions, but a single, continuous line. One final thread remained to be pulled. At precisely 7 o'clock the following morning, Poirot requested Inspector Webb to join him in Sir Lionel's study. "You are certain now?" Webb asked as he entered. Poirot inclined his head. "Certain enough to risk being contradicted." Webb snorted. "That'll be a first." Poirot smiled politely. "Inspector, may I ask, why do you think Sir Lionel waited until the next day to confront Mr. Hale?" Webb frowned. "To gather proof?" "Exactly," Poirot replied. Sir Lionel was not impulsive. He planned. He arranged documents, wrote letters, prepared his case. He tapped the desk lightly. "That is why Mr. Hale acted early. He did not need to escape suspicion, only delay it." They heard voices approaching. Poirot had asked that everyone be present. The household gathered slowly. Lady Ashcroft composed but weary, Gerald tense and defensive, Miss Finch pale, her hands clasped tightly, Mr. Bernard Hale calm on the surface, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. Inspector Webb took his place near the door. Poirot stood by the desk, the travelling clock resting beside him. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are very close now. I ask only your attention." Gerald muttered something under his breath, but remained silent. Poirot lifted the clock. "This object has been central to our confusion. It suggested a time which did not exist." He turned it over, revealing the back. Inside, a regulating pin was removed, temporarily. This allowed the clock to run incorrectly, then be restored. A clever deception. Hale leaned back. "Anyone could have done that." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "Anyone with the knowledge." Hale smiled faintly. "And you have no proof it was me?" Poirot nodded. "Proof? No, yet." He turned to Miss Finch. "Mademoiselle, you said Sir Lionel believed someone was interfering. Did he say when he first noticed this?" "Yes," she said softly. 2 days before his death." Poirot nodded. "And Mr. Hale arrived that same day?" Hale's smile tightened. Poirot continued smoothly. "Sir Lionel trusted you, monsieur. He gave you access to documents, to the study, to his confidence. But trust, once questioned, becomes dangerous." Gerald spoke sharply. "You're still talking in circles." Poirot looked at him kindly. "Monsieur, patience." He turned back to Hale. "Tell me, did you visit Sir Lionel on the evening of his death before Lady Ashcroft served the cocoa?" Hale met his gaze evenly. "No." Poirot nodded. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He held up a small object between 2 fingers, a metal pin. Hale's eyes flickered. "This pin," Poirot said, "belongs inside the travelling clock. I found it lodged behind the skirting board beneath Sir Lionel's desk." Inspector Webb straightened. "You didn't mention that." "I wished to see who would recognize it," Poirot replied. Hale laughed shortly. "That proves nothing." "On the contrary," Poirot said calmly, "it proves presence. Someone knelt there recently, someone precise enough to retrieve the pin, but careless enough to drop it." Silence thickened. Poirot pressed on. "You visited Sir Lionel early that evening. You brought him cocoa, as you had done before during your discussions. This time, it was poisoned." Lady Ashcroft gasped softly. "The poison induced drowsiness," Poirot continued. "Sir Lionel did not realize what was happening. You left him alive, but already condemned." Hale rose abruptly. "This is speculation." Poirot did not raise his voice. "You then altered the clocks, not all at once, just enough to create disagreement. You relied on human certainty. You knew everyone would defend their version of time." Inspector Webb stepped forward. "Mr. Hale." Poirot raised a hand. "One moment more." He turned to Miss Finch. Sir Lionel wrote you a letter. He intended to confront Mr. Hale the following day. That letter remained unopened because he never had the chance. Miss Finch nodded, tears in her eyes. Poirot faced Hale again. You expected confusion. You expected suspicion to fall elsewhere, on anger, on grief, on opportunity. Hale's face hardened. And what about motive? Poirot smiled sadly. Money, monsieur, and exposure. Sir Lionel discovered irregularities in the trust. He was not a man who forgave disorder. Inspector Webb spoke sharply. We confirmed the discrepancies this morning. Hale's composure cracked at last. You think I killed him because of bookkeeping errors? Poirot's voice was gentle. I think you killed him because time ran out. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hale exhaled slowly and sank back into his chair. You are very observant, he said quietly. Too observant. Inspector Webb moved forward at once. Mr. Bernard Hale, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Lionel Ashcroft. Lady Ashcroft closed her eyes. Gerald stared at the floor. Miss Finch let out a shaking breath. Poirot remained still. As Hale was led away, he turned once more toward Poirot. It was the clocks, wasn't it? Poirot nodded. You noticed when they changed. Hale gave a bitter smile. I thought that made me careful. It made you visible, Poirot replied. When the door closed behind the inspector and his prisoner, Ashcroft Hall seemed to exhale. Poirot adjusted the travelling clock gently, setting it aside. One more chapter, he murmured. And then, order. Chapter 8. Order restored. The final morning at Ashcroft Hall arrived quietly, as though the house itself wished to avoid further disturbance. Pale sunlight crept through the windows, touching the furniture gently, revealing nothing new. Yet everything felt changed. The clocks, still unsynchronized, continued to tick with stubborn independence, but their discord no longer felt threatening. They were relics now, not weapons. Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing room, examining them one last time. Inspector Webb entered, hat in hand, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. I'll admit it, he said. You were right from the start. I chased motives, you chased meaning. Poirot smiled modestly. Both are necessary, Inspector, but motive explains why, meaning explains how. Webb nodded. Hales confessed, not in detail yet, but enough. The poison, the early visit, the clocks. He thought confusion would buy him time. Poirot's eyes softened. Time rarely forgives arrogance. They were joined shortly by the others. Lady Ashcroft entered first. The rigidity that had defined her since Sir Lionel's death had finally softened. Grief remained, but it was no longer sharpened by suspicion. She approached Poirot slowly. I owe you more than I can say, she said quietly. You restored my husband's dignity. Poirot bowed slightly. Madame, Sir Lionel was a man of order. It would have distressed him greatly to leave chaos behind. She managed a faint smile. He would have approved of you. Gerald Ashcroft hovered near the doorway, awkward and subdued. His earlier anger had burned itself out, leaving only shame. I was wrong, he said abruptly. About everything, about him, about all of you. Poirot regarded him kindly. Monsieur, impatience clouds judgment, but recognition, that is the beginning of wisdom. Gerald nodded, relieved not to be condemned. Miss Finch entered last. She clutched a small folder of papers, though her hands no longer trembled. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I found the rest of the documents, she said. Sir Lionel's notes. He suspected irregularities, but he wanted proof before accusing anyone. Poirot nodded. A cautious man, even at the end. Inspector Webb cleared his throat. Before I leave, Monsieur Poirot, Perhaps you would care to explain it all cleanly for the record." Poirot smiled. "But of course, clarity is the final courtesy." They seated themselves. Poirot stood before them, immaculate as ever, and began. Sir Lionel Ashcroft valued precision. He trusted systems, schedules, and order. When he discovered discrepancies in the charitable trust, he did not react impulsively. He observed, he prepared. He paused, ensuring their attention. Mr. Hale realized this. He understood that exposure was inevitable, so he acted, not violently, not emotionally, but methodically. Poirot gestured gently toward the clocks. He poisoned Sir Lionel early in the evening using a slow-acting compound. Sir Lionel felt only fatigue. He did not suspect. Lady Ashcroft closed her eyes briefly. "Then," Poirot continued, "Mr. Hale interfered with the clocks, not to stop time, but to fragment it. Each person relied on a different measure, a different certainty. Memory became unreliable. Suspicion scattered. Inspector Webb nodded. Everyone defended their version of the evening. "Precisely," Poirot said. Meanwhile, Mr. Hale placed the travelling clock on the desk to anchor a false timeline. He relied on human confidence in objects. Poirot allowed himself a small smile. But he underestimated one thing. Gerald leaned forward. "What?" "Psychology," Poirot replied. "Guilty minds notice disturbances. Innocent minds adapt. Mr. Hale could not help but react when order was disrupted." Miss Finch whispered, "The clocks." "Yes," Poirot said. "They betrayed him." He concluded softly. Sir Lionel believed time revealed truth. He was correct, only not in the way he expected. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. Inspector Webb stood. "I'll ensure everything proceeds properly. The estate, the trust." Lady Ashcroft nodded. Sir Lionel would have wanted that. As Webb departed, Poirot remained behind, alone once more in the drawing room. He approached the clocks. One by one, he adjusted them. The mantel clock first, the carriage clock next, the grandfather clock last. When he finished, they agreed. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, a single, unified rhythm. Lady Ashcroft watched from the doorway. "You didn't have to do that." Poirot smiled gently. "Madame, disorder left unresolved has a way of returning." She inclined her head in thanks and withdrew. Poirot collected his hat and gloves. As he stepped into the entrance hall, Parker the butler opened the door for him. "Safe travels, Monsieur Poirot," Parker said. "The house already feels quieter." Poirot paused, listening to the steady ticking behind him. "Yes," he agreed. "It is at peace." Outside, the day was clear. Poirot walked down the gravel drive without haste, his mind already moving on. Time would continue, as it always did. But for Ashcroft Hall, the truth had arrived precisely when it was needed. The case is closed, but the next mystery is already waiting. This is unknown suspect.